That door wasn't just closing, it was sealing. 4 men outside it, federal paper in their pockets, pistols under their coats. And inside, one mother with her babies pinned behind her like a last line of defense. Nobody in that cabin was walking away clean. I'll tell you what most people never understand about moments like this. The violence doesn't start with a scream. It starts with a number. Somewhere back in Kentucky, a man with soft hands and a hard smile sat at a desk and did the kind of math that turns blood into profit. He didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to threaten anybody. He just had to write it down. A woman, a husband, 4 children, and beside each name a price. That's the part polite society pretends is business. But I've been around enough men who hide behind ledgers to know what a list like that really is. It's a death notice with better handwriting. Her name was Margaret, 22. Young enough that life should have still had room for hope. Old enough to know hope was a trick they sold to keep you quiet. She lived on a place that looked respectable from a distance. Big house, tall columns, church talk on Sundays. The kind of property where visitors ate well, laughed easy, and told each other they were decent people. Decent, that word gets used like soap. Folks rub it on their hands and act surprised when the water runs red. Behind that main house, there were cabins lined up like they were ordered and clean. But order ain't dignity. A straight row of cages is still cages. In those cabins, everybody learned the same skill: how to read danger before it speaks, how to spot a mood in a man's eyes before his hands start moving, how to keep your face calm when your stomach is doing flips. Margaret learned it early. Her mother learned it earlier, and neither one had the luxury of pretending the world was fair, because the world she lived in was built on a rule that never needed saying out loud. Your body belonged to somebody else, and if you happen to have children, they belonged too. Now here's where the game gets sick. Margaret's babies weren't priced like regular children. They were tagged high, too high. When a man values a child like that, it's not because he's got a soft heart. It's because he's got a market. You can call it whatever you want to sleep at night: house service, training, placement. I've seen men do that same dance in different decades in different neighborhoods with different paperwork. They dress it up, but the engine under it is always the same. A buyer with appetite, a seller with no soul, and a child who never had a vote. Margaret didn't need a lawyer to understand what those numbers meant. She didn't need a newspaper. She didn't need a sermon. She had eyes. She watched how the master's son lingered too long, how he spoke to her like he owned the air around her, how he moved through the quarters like a man taking inventory. And she watched her first boy grow, light in the face, wrong in the eyes, not wrong like ugly, wrong like familiar. The kind of familiar that makes the wrong people comfortable. That's the part that stays buried under respectability. Some men don't just own the work, they take the women. Then they smile in church and call themselves God-fearing. Margaret swallowed that truth for years because what choice did she have? In her world, the truth didn't free you. It just got you hurt faster, so she did what smart people do when the table is rigged. She stayed quiet, she watched, she learned, and she waited. But waiting has a cost, because while she was learning how to survive, somebody else was planning what to do with her children. That plan didn't come from the sky. It arrived on horseback. The overseer was the kind of man who didn't need a reason to be cruel. Cruelty was his resting face. A man like that doesn't wake up and become a monster. He wakes up and continues. He found her working, hands in hot water, doing the kind of labor that eats your skin and never pays you back. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't have to. He spat in the dirt like it belonged to him too, and he told her, casual as weather, that her oldest boy was being sold. Not later, not someday, soon, so close you could taste it. And he said it like it was a favor, like it was a simple adjustment in the household. That's another thing people don't understand. Sometimes the worst news doesn't come with drama. It comes with boredom. Margaret felt the room tilt, not because she was weak, because she knew exactly where sold led when a child had a premium price and the wrong kind of look. That night she walked through cold and mud and dark to find her husband, Robert. Walked like a woman who already knew the future had teeth. Robert wasn't a poet. He wasn't a dreamer. He was muscle and breath and quiet rage, the kind of man who carries his thoughts behind his ribs. He took one look at her face and he didn't ask for the story twice. She told him. He didn't scream. He didn't fall apart. He did what a man does when he knows the rules are about to crush everything he loves. He said the only sentence that matters in a cage. Then we move. That river up north, the Ohio, wasn't just water. It was a line. One side your property, other side you might get to be a person. Might is doing a lot of work there, but when you're drowning, you don't argue with a plank. They'd heard stories. Everybody had. Some were true. Some were lies told to keep hope alive. Dogs that could smell your fear. Patrols that rode roads like they were hunting trails. Men who made money bringing runaways back dead or alive. And the biggest trick of all, even if you crossed that river, there were laws that could reach across and grab you anyway. Paper chains. Legal chains. Chains that let a man in a uniform drag you out of a free state and act like he was doing God's work. Margaret knew about those chains too, but she also knew something else. Her boy didn't have time for debates, so they built a plan like people build when they're surrounded. Quick, quiet, ugly if it had to be. They found help from a man who knew how to move bodies without making noise. The kind of operator that exists in every era. Not a hero, not a saint. Just somebody who knows roots and timing and what silence is worth. A sleigh, horses, blankets, 17 souls, that's not a group, that's a liability. Too many people means too many chances for a cough, a cry, a mistake. But desperation makes you take risks you'd never take with a full stomach. The weather turned in their favor the way it sometimes does right before something terrible. Snow fell heavy. Sound got swallowed. Tracks got covered. Cold hit hard enough to make your lungs hurt, and the river started to lock up. Ice on moving water is a lie you pray is true. They left in the dark. No speeches. No goodbyes. Just the soft shuffle of feet and the kind of breathing you do when your life depends on staying quiet. Margaret wrapped the baby tight. She kept her hand close, ready to cover a mouth if fear tried to turn into noise. She could feel Robert behind them, guarding the rear like a man who already decided what he'd do if someone came riding up. They reached the river and the ice talked back. Creaks. Groans. Sharp sounds like the surface was arguing with the weight of human hope. The guide tested it and his face told the truth before his mouth did. Not safe. Not solid. But there was no turning back. Turning back meant chains. Turning back meant that sail. Turning back meant watching your child get carried away while you stood there and did nothing because you weren't allowed to do anything. So they carved a path the hard way. Metal biting ice. Hands burning from cold. Seconds feeling like minutes. And every sound traveling too far in the still night. Single file. One mistake in the river would eat somebody. Margaret went forward anyway. Because mothers don't always get to choose what kind of courage they carry. She stepped where she was told. She listened for cracks. She felt the ice shift under her like a living thing. At one point the surface gave a warning, a sudden slip, a jolt of panic, and she felt a hand clamp her arm and pull her back into balance. Robert, no words, just grip. That's how survival works when you don't have time for comfort. They made it, not clean, not safe, but across. And when her feet hit the Ohio side, Margaret did something that sounds small until you understand what it costs. She let herself believe it for half a second. Free ground, free air, a chance. They moved fast because freedom isn't a place you arrive, it's a place you defend. They found a cabin that belonged to family. A man with a door he could close because nobody owned him. Fire, warmth, food. The children sank into sleep like their bodies finally trusted the night. And Margaret sat there watching them, not smiling, not celebrating, just watching, because she knew the game. I can tell you right now, that's what separates the ones who survive from the ones who get caught. The survivors don't relax just because the danger got quiet. They know quiet can be a setup. Dawn came thin and gray. And with dawn came the sound that changed everything. Boots, not friendly boots, not the soft shuffle of somebody bringing help. Hard steps, purposeful. Several men moving like they already owned the room they hadn't entered yet. The knock didn't come polite, it came like a warning. Then came voices, white voices talking the language of authority. Federal authority. That's a nasty kind of power, because it doesn't care what state you're in, doesn't care what you believe, doesn't care what you survived. It only cares about what's written on the paper. Margaret's husband stood up fast, eyes sharp, scanning for angles like he was looking for a way to flip the board. But the board was already surrounded. And Margaret didn't reach for a prayer. She reached for the thing she'd hidden away, the thing she told herself she'd never have to use. Because she knew what was on the other side of that door wasn't just a rest. It was a return, it was ownership. It was the whole machine firing back up with her children inside it. The door frame shuddered under impact. Wood groaned. The baby stirred. And in that split second, right before the lock gave up, Margaret's eyes did something I've seen in men who are about to make a decision they can't undo. They went calm. Not peaceful, strategic, like she just found the only move left on the board, and then the door started to break. The first plank cracked, then the whole door gave up like it was tired of pretending it could protect anybody. Cold air rushed in, snow smell, gun oil. And the kind of confidence men carry when the law is backing their violence. 4 of them came through the opening, not neighbors, not friends, not help. Federal men, bounty muscle, and behind their shoulders the real owners of the night, Kentucky money, Kentucky entitlement, standing there like they were reclaiming a misplaced tool. One of the men flashed papers without even fully unfolding them. He didn't need to. In that era, a piece of paper could outweigh a heartbeat. By authority. He didn't finish the sentence before Robert moved. That's what people do wrong when they tell stories like this. They act like the victims are passive, like they just kneel and accept their fate. No, Robert grabbed what he could, iron from the fire, the first heavy thing that felt like a chance. He swung once, hard, desperate, aimed to break rhythm. To buy seconds, it connected. One of the men stumbled back, cursing, surprised that property had teeth. But surprise only lasts a breath. The pistols came up fast after that. You could hear the metal in the room. That little click that tells you a man has decided the next sound might be a death. Margaret backed deeper into the cabin, pulling the children with her without even touching them, just guiding them with her body. Babies and toddlers don't understand laws, they understand fear. They understand when a room turns sharp. The man in front, leader type, leveled his gun like he'd done it before, like he'd practiced putting people in their place. Drop whatever you got in your hand. He wasn't asking. He was giving her a choice designed to look like mercy. Margaret didn't drop anything, not because she wanted to be brave, because she knew what obedience bought you in that world: a quicker chain, a tighter rope, a quieter ride back south. The family member who owned the cabin, Joe, stepped forward with his palms open, voice shaking but steady enough to try. "This is Ohio," he said. "You can't." The leader cut him off with a look. That look said, "I don't care where I'm standing," and he didn't. He took a step inside like the cabin belonged to him now, like the fire in the hearth was federal property too. Margaret watched his feet. You learn to watch feet when you've lived around men who strike without warning. Hands can lie. Faces can lie. Feet don't lie. And those feet were positioned for one thing: closing distance. One of the other men angled to the side, lining up behind Robert, ready to hit him from the blind spot. Classic work. Crowd a man, split his attention, then take him down. They had the numbers, they had the weapons, they had the law. That's the ugly holy trinity right there. Robert realized it too. You could see it in his shoulders. He wasn't thinking about winning. He was thinking about making them pay for every inch. But Margaret wasn't watching for a fight. She was watching the future, and she could see it clearer than anyone in that room. Because to those men, her children weren't children. They were shipments. They were investments. They were leverage. That's why they came armed. That's why they came early. That's why nobody knocked politely. The leader took another step, and one of the bounty men reached out, aiming for Margaret's wrist. Not her shoulder, not her hair, her wrist. That's control. That's ownership. That's how you disarm a person without giving them the dignity of being seen as a threat. His fingers almost touched her. And in that moment, Margaret did what people only do when every door is locked from the outside. She moved first. It wasn't wild. It wasn't messy panic. It was the kind of motion you make when you've been planning in your head for days and praying you never need to follow through. Fast, direct, final. A child cried out. Someone shouted her name. Robert roared like an animal caught in a trap. The room exploded into chaos, but Margaret stayed centered like she was standing in the eye of it. That's the part that made witnesses talk later, not the violence. Violence is common when power shows up hungry. What shook people was the calm. That cold, controlled calm of a person making the only move left. One man lunged again, trying to stop her. Robert slammed into him, driving him back with pure force, turning the cabin into a storm of bodies and curses and scraping boots. A neighbor burst in. Then another. Then another. Too late. Always too late. The cabin filled with voices, some screaming, some praying, some ordering. And through it all, Margaret stood with her chest rising and falling like she'd run miles, even though she hadn't moved more than a few steps. The leader shoved his pistol toward her face, close enough that she could smell whatever he'd been drinking to stay warm. His hand was shaking now, not from fear of her, from fear of what he was looking at. "You done killed your own," he started. Margaret's eyes lifted, not pleading, not begging, measuring. She looked past him toward the doorway where the Kentucky men hovered, stunned. The same men who owned ledgers, who spoke softly at supper, who called themselves respectable. Respectable men don't like to see the cost of their business laid out in a cabin on free soil. It embarrasses them. It makes them look like what they are. Margaret's voice came out low, not a shout, not a performance, just truth. "You don't get them back." The leader swallowed hard, trying to reassert himself. "You're coming with us." Robert tried to surge forward again, but two men jumped him at once. One hooked his arms, the other drove a fist into his ribs. Robert still fought because some men would rather be broken than be handled. A gun butt came down. Bone met wood. Robert dropped to a knee, still trying to rise. They didn't want him dead. Dead doesn't work the fields. Dead doesn't fetch a price. Dead doesn't suffer. Margaret watched them pin her husband like he was a piece of furniture. Then she looked at the children who were still breathing, still here, still trapped. The ones she hadn't reached. The ones the law was about to rename as property again. That's when her face finally shifted, not to grief, not to madness, to calculation. Because she understood something the men with badges didn't. This wasn't over at the cabin. This was about to move into courtrooms and newspapers and backroom deals. This was about to turn into a national argument where white men debated whether she was human enough to punish or property enough to return. They dragged her outside, chains on her wrists, cold air on her blood-wet clothes, people gathering in the road, staring like they'd never seen the truth up close before. A few women covered their mouths. One man whispered, "Lord have mercy." The leader kept his gun out anyway, like he was afraid she might tear the sky open. And as they hauled her toward a wagon, one of the Kentucky men finally found his voice. Not outrage, not sorrow, panic. Because panic isn't about what you did. It's about what you might expose. He leaned close to the marshal and spoke in a hurry, like money was bleeding out of his pockets. "We need the boy moved," he said. "Now, before Ohio gets clever." Margaret heard that, and something in her chest tightened because she knew exactly what that meant. Not moved like protected, moved like sold, moved like erased. She twisted in the chains and locked eyes with Robert one last time. He was on his knees, face swelling, breathing hard, staring at her like he wanted to pull the world apart with his hands. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She gave him a look that said, "Listen close." "They're not done," she murmured. "They're about to take the one thing I couldn't stop." And as the wagon lurched forward, she saw one of the men break away from the group, already heading back toward the river fast. Like he was running to deliver a message. Like time was money. Like somebody's life was about to be traded before morning. The wagon wheels sounded different once they hit the road. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. That's how power moves when it knows it's winning. Margaret sat chained on a hard plank, blood stiffening in the cold, watching houses slide past that all looked warm, clean, untouched by what had just happened. Curtains drawn, breakfast fires starting, normal life rolling on like nothing had cracked open down the road. That's another trick of the game. The world keeps going even when it eats you. The marshal riding beside her didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence was the kind that comes from certainty. He believed the paperwork would protect him from whatever ghosts followed, but Margaret wasn't thinking about him. She was thinking about the boy, her first one, the one they were already moving. She could feel it. Same way you feel weather before it breaks. Same way you feel a trap before it snaps. When you grow up owned, you learn to sense urgency in other people's footsteps. They stopped at the jail through the back entrance. No crowd control, no speeches, just iron doors and narrow halls that smelled like damp stone and old fear. They pushed her into a cell already crowded with other runaways. Different faces, same eyes, eyes that had learned how to leave the body when the body couldn't take it anymore. Someone whispered her name. She didn't answer, not because she didn't hear, because she was listening for something else. Down the corridor through thick walls, she heard a sound that made her breath catch. Robert, not words, just breathing, heavy, broken, still alive. That sound told her two things. He was still fighting, and they hadn't finished with him yet. Hours passed strange in that place. Time bent, stretched, folded back on itself. At some point, a man in a clean coat came to look at her like she was a problem to be solved. Prosecutor type. Eyes sharp but not cruel. He talked about charges, about Ohio law, about murder. He used that word like it was supposed to end the conversation. Margaret looked at him like he was speaking a foreign language. Murder. That word only means something when life is already respected. He left frustrated. Soon after, another man came. Different energy, older, quieter. Eyes that had seen enough to know the rules were rotten. He called her Mrs. That stopped her cold. Not girl, not property, not it. Mrs. Titles matter when the world keeps trying to erase you. He asked why, not how, not when. Why? Margaret took a long breath, the kind you take when you're about to open a door you've kept locked for years. Because death doesn't get sold, she said, that was all. The man closed his notebook slow, like he was handling something dangerous. Later that night, the news reached her cell without anyone saying it directly. You hear things in jail. Words travel. Panic leaks through cracks. The boy had been sold, already. Cash deal, clean, fast, across the river, onto a boat, southbound, no appeal, no waiting, just a transaction. That was the moment Margaret finally broke, not screaming, not thrashing. She folded inward, hands clenched, rocking once like her body tried to remember how comfort worked. That was the child she'd been trying to outrun fate for. And fate had moved faster. Outside those walls, the city was splitting. Some folks called her a monster. Some called her a mother. Most didn't want to call her anything at all, because naming her meant naming the system that put her there. Lawyers argued. Preachers shouted. Newspapers printed opinions like bullets. And in the middle of it all sat a woman in chains who had forced the country into a corner it couldn't talk its way out of. Because now the question wasn't just what she did. It was what they were going to do with her. If she was a person, they had to face why she chose death over return. If she was property, they had to admit the law was protecting something so evil it drove mothers to blood. They couldn't have it both ways, and that terrified them. Margaret lay back against the cold wall, eyes open, staring at nothing. She wasn't waiting for mercy. She wasn't waiting for forgiveness. She was waiting for the next move, because she knew the game wasn't over. Not in that jail, not in that city, not in that country. Somewhere south, a 6-year-old boy was being carried toward a future she could barely imagine. Somewhere north, men in suits were deciding whether she lived as a criminal or disappeared as inventory. And somewhere in between, the truth was sitting like a loaded weapon on a courtroom table, daring someone to pick it up. The question wasn't whether blood had been spilled. The question was who was finally going to pay for it. And that answer hadn't come yet. Morning came with noise, not birds. Not church bells. Voices, angry ones, the kind that stack up outside stone walls and start believing their own heat. Margaret heard it before she saw anyone, a low roar filtering through iron and brick, shouts colliding with each other, some calling her name like a prayer, others spitting it like poison. That's when she understood something important. This wasn't her story anymore. It had become a weapon. They brought her out in chains again, this time through corridors lined with men who wouldn't meet her eyes, deputies, clerks, guards who suddenly found the floor very interesting, because they knew, once the public gets involved, the rules get slippery. Once people start arguing about whether someone is human, things don't stay neat. The courtroom was packed before she ever stepped inside. Too many bodies, too much breath. Windows cracked open to let the cold in because the air was already burning. Margaret felt it hit her like pressure. Eyes everywhere. White eyes, curious eyes, judging eyes. Some looked at her like she was a beast behind glass. Some looked at her like she was a mirror they didn't want to face. They sat her down hard. Chains clinked. The sound carried, that sound mattered. It reminded everyone that whatever they decided today, she wasn't walking out free. Not really. The judge came in slow, face heavy. A man who'd spent his life balancing on the fence, now realizing the fence was on fire. The argument started fast. Federal men saying one thing, state men saying another. Property versus person. Paper versus blood. Every sentence felt like a man trying to win without admitting what winning actually cost. Margaret didn't follow every word. She followed tone, body language, the way voices tightened when certain truths came too close. Then her lawyer stood, quiet, no theatrics. That scared them more than shouting ever could. He didn't argue that she hadn't done it. He didn't beg for sympathy. He framed it different. He said, plain and steady, that she had acted to prevent a greater harm, that she had chosen the only door left open, that if any mother in that room, any color, faced the same future for her child, the word crime would sound different. The room shifted, not loudly, but enough. The other side exploded, objections, raised voices. Men standing without being asked. The judge slammed his gavel like it might restore order, but you can't unhear a truth once it's spoken clean. Margaret finally lifted her head. She met the judge's eyes, not defiant, not pleading, present. That look unsettled him, because it said something dangerous. It said, I know exactly what you're deciding, not just my fate, but your reflection. The judge called a recess. Coward move, necessary move. Outside, the crowd grew louder, abolitionists pressing forward, pro-slavery men pushing back, words turning sharp, fists itching. Inside a side room, men with power leaned close and spoke fast. They didn't talk about justice. They talked about precedent, about what would happen if she was recognized as fully human, about what it would mean if a jury heard why she did what she did, because once you say it out loud, you can't stuff it back into silence. And then came the news that cut through everything. Another child was dead, the one with the cracked skull, gone. The room went quiet in a way that wasn't respectful. It was scared. Because now there were no maybes, no survival stories to soften the edges. Blood had a final count. Margaret didn't cry when they told her. She nodded once. She won't be touched, she said. Somebody turned away, suddenly unable to hold her gaze. That death changed the math. Charges shifted, stakes doubled. And somewhere in all of it, while lawyers argued and crowds screamed and judges hesitated, the men who owned ledgers made another move. They sold the boy, not later, not after rulings, now, fast enough that even the court couldn't catch up. When Margaret learned that, something in her finally cracked open. Not hysteria, grief, pure, heavy, unavoidable. The child she had crossed ice for. The one she'd gambled everything to protect. Gone. South. Erased into the same machine she'd tried to break. Her lawyer saw it in her face and understood the truth before she said it. This case was no longer about saving her. It was about forcing the country to look at what it had already done. And as court reconvened and the judge took his seat again, everyone felt it. They were standing at the edge of something they couldn't control anymore. A ruling was coming, one way or another. And whatever words the judge chose next were going to light a fire that wouldn't go out quietly. The judge cleared his throat like it might steady his hands. It didn't. You could see it in the way he shifted his papers, like the words might rearrange themselves if he touched them enough. Men like him spend their whole lives believing the law is a wall. Solid. Protective. That morning he realized it was a trapdoor. He ruled that she would be tried. Not returned yet, not freed, tried. A compromise dressed up as wisdom. And everyone in that room knew what compromises really are. Delays, the marshals didn't like it. The Kentucky men liked it even less. A trial meant questions. Questions meant witnesses. Witnesses meant truth slipping through cracks they'd spent generations sealing. Margaret was taken back to her cell, chains heavier now, not because they weighed more, but because she finally felt what they were attached to. Time. They didn't let her see Robert, didn't let her see the surviving child, didn't let her see anyone who might remind her she was still human. That's another strategy. Isolation weakens resistance. But it didn't work the way they hoped, because Margaret had already crossed the point where fear controls you. When you've done the unthinkable, there's nothing left for fear to bargain with. Her lawyer came again, face drawn, eyes burning with a mix of anger and purpose. He told her what was coming. Testimony. Questions designed to humiliate. Men on the stand swearing nothing bad ever happened. Ledgers waved like scripture. And then, if he played it right, he would ask the questions no one ever asked in polite courtrooms. Who fathered the children? Why light skin carried a higher price? Where those shipments really went? Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said one thing. Let them hear it. He hesitated. Once it's spoken, he warned, they'll never stop calling you names. She shrugged. They already did worse. Trial day came heavy. Soldiers at the doors, armed guards inside, the city vibrating like a wire pulled too tight. Margaret walked in wearing clean clothes this time, but she carried the stained dress folded in her hands like evidence that breathed. The jury watched her like men deciding whether a storm was natural or their fault. Witness after witness talked around the truth. They described blood, screams, the knife. They avoided the why like it was contagious. Then came the ledger. Pages opened. Numbers read aloud. Suitable for Southern placement. Premium valuation. House markets. The words floated in the air, polite and poisonous. Margaret watched the jurors' faces shift when the meaning finally caught up. Then her lawyer called the master's son. The room tightened. The young man took the stand confident, polished, practiced in being believed. He denied cruelty, denied wrongdoing, denied memory, until the questions narrowed, until dates lined up, until the resemblance was spoken out loud. That's when the room broke, not into chaos, into silence. The dangerous kind. Margaret was called last. She stood slowly, chains clinking. Eyes forward, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She told them what happened to her when she was young, who came at night, what light skin meant, what the word sold actually looked like when you followed it far enough south. One juror stared at his hands like he couldn't wash them clean. Another swallowed hard and looked away. The prosecutor tried to shake her. You killed them, he said. She met his eyes. I stopped them from being owned. The judge called order, but it was already gone. The jury left to deliberate. Hours passed. The crowd outside waited like the city was holding its breath. When they returned, the verdict split the room. Guilty of one count, not guilty of the rest. A half measure, enough to punish her, not enough to fully deny why she did it. Sentencing came quick. Prison time, years. But before the words finished echoing, the marshals stood. Federal authority reclaimed the floor. Chains were tightened. Orders read. She was no longer just a defendant. She was once again a fugitive asset. Margaret turned once, scanning the room, not looking for pity, looking for memory, because she knew what they were about to do. They were about to erase her, to ship her south, sell her again, bury her story under profit and distance. As they led her out, someone in the gallery shouted her name. Another voice answered, then another, not cheering, not screaming, remembering. Margaret didn't look back. She didn't need to. She already knew the truth. They could drag her body wherever they wanted. But the question she'd forced into the open, that was free now, and it was going to haunt them longer than she ever could. The river saw her again, different boat, same direction, south. That water had a memory. It carried too many bodies, too many prayers, too many deals made in whispers. And as the steamboat churned forward, Margaret stood near the rail with chains biting her wrists, feeling the pull of it like a voice calling her name. They thought the case was over. That was their mistake. Men in uniform watched her close, but not close enough to understand what kind of stillness they were dealing with. They thought broken meant finished. They thought grief meant obedience. They didn't understand resolve. The surviving child, Mary, was with her, small, weak, quiet in that way children get when they've learned the world isn't safe to ask questions in. The girl leaned into Margaret's side like she knew instinctively this was the last wall between her and the dark. The boat creaked. Water slapped wood. Chains rattled with every step. Somewhere upriver, deals were already being finalized. Names scratched into fresh ledgers. Futures reassigned. Margaret's value recalculated now that she'd become trouble. Trouble always gets sold cheap. Night came down thick. That's when Margaret moved. Not sudden, not frantic, intentional. She lifted Mary into her arms and stepped closer to the rail, close enough that the cold spray kissed her face, close enough that one wrong sway could end everything. A crewman noticed, shouted, boots rushed, hands reached. In that split second, shorter than a prayer, Margaret made another choice. Whether it was escape, whether it was mercy, whether it was defiance, history never agreed. She went over the side. Water swallowed sound. The river took them both into its black chest. Chaos erupted on deck. Men yelling, ropes thrown, lanterns swinging wild. They pulled Mary back, barely. Margaret came up choking, eyes open, hair plastered to her face, dragged back aboard by men who were suddenly afraid of what she might do next. Mary survived. Margaret lived. Some said she tried to finish what she started. Others said she was trying to disappear. The truth sat somewhere deeper than the river. After that, they stopped underestimating her. They sold her again, further south, quieter, harder ground. A place where stories don't travel fast and questions get buried with the answers. Records thin out after that. A name, a price, a destination, then silence. Some swear she died young. Some swear she escaped during the war when the world finally cracked open and the chains loosened just enough for the desperate. No one ever proved either. But here's what I know. Men who build empires on ownership don't fear screaming victims. They fear calm ones. They fear the kind who see the whole board. The kind who make moves so final they force everyone else to reveal their hand. Margaret did that. She forced a nation to look at itself and decide what it was willing to call justice. And that decision, it's still unfinished, because every time power tries to turn people into numbers, every time a child becomes a commodity, every time the law protects profit over life, that cabin door starts to crack again. And somewhere, that quiet, dangerous question comes back into the room. What would you do when there's only one move left? They thought distance would finish it. That's always the last lie power tells itself. Margaret was moved the way men move problems. Quiet, quick, no witnesses worth remembering. Sold downriver to a place where the land was meaner and the knights didn't bother pretending to be kind. New plantation, new overseer, same rules, but something had changed, not in her, in the people around her. Word travels in fragments, a whisper here. A look held too long there. Stories don't need to be accurate to be dangerous. They just need to exist. And Margaret's story existed now. Not as a headline, not as a court transcript, as a warning. The women watched her closely, not with fear. With recognition, they saw the stillness in her. The way she didn't flinch when shouted at. The way she didn't rush. Didn't scramble. Men who live by force expect noise, tears, pleas. They don't know what to do with silence that studies them back. The overseer learned that fast. He tried the usual tactics. Longer hours, smaller portions. Sharp words meant to bend her posture. Margaret absorbed it all like stone absorbs weather. No reaction. That made him uneasy. Because unease is the first crack in authority. At night in cabins where the dark carried stories better than daylight, people asked questions. Low ones, careful ones. Is it true? Did she really do it? Did she really stand up to them? Margaret didn't boast, didn't explain. She said just enough. They don't own my mind. That was it, but that sentence spread. And sentences like that are more dangerous than knives, because they don't cut one throat. They cut systems. The overseer reported her as difficult. The owner marked her as unreliable. Those are labels men use right before they make a permanent decision. Sell again. Break her further. Disappear her. Margaret sensed it coming, same way she always had. The board was shifting. And this time there was no courtroom, no crowd, no witnesses to slow things down. just swamp air, heavy nights, and men who believed distance had erased consequences. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the trees, a rider came down the lane. Not local, clean boots, new hat. The kind of man who asks quiet questions and writes things down later. Margaret watched him from the edge of the field. He didn't look at her directly, but she knew. When men show up like that, somebody's fate is being recalculated. That night the quarters were restless. Dogs barked longer than usual. Lanterns moved where they shouldn't have. Margaret lay awake, breathing slow, counting steps in the dirt outside. She didn't know if this was the night they sold her again, or the night they decided she was too dangerous to keep alive. Both were on the table. And the thing about women like Margaret, they don't wait to find out. Somewhere beyond the trees, the river still moved south. Somewhere north, war clouds were starting to gather, even if no one wanted to say it yet. And in the dark, with danger circling again, Margaret made a decision. Not loud. Not desperate. The kind of decision that changes everything later. By morning, one of two things would be true. Either she would still be property, or she would be gone. And nobody in that place slept easy, because on some level they all knew. If she disappeared, they'd never know how or who she'd spoken to before she did. Morning came wrong, too quiet. No barking dogs, no shouted orders, no boots stomping the dirt like they owned it. Silence like that doesn't mean peace. It means somebody moved early. By the time the sun cleared the trees, they knew Margaret's pallet was empty, not torn up, not rushed, folded, careful, like she didn't want to leave chaos behind, just absence. The overseer lost his voice yelling before he found his anger. Men fanned out. Dogs were brought in late, already confused by dew and distance and the fact that whoever left hadn't run. Running leaves panic in the ground. This didn't. This was walking, purposeful, measured, like someone who knew exactly where they were going and how much time they had. They searched the river first because that's where desperate people go. They didn't find her. They searched the roads next because that's where foolish people go. Still nothing. By noon, fear crept in, not for her but for them. Because escape without noise means help, and help means a network. Someone had spoken to someone. Someone had decided that whatever trouble came with her was worth it. That's how revolutions really start. Not with speeches, with one risky decision to help the wrong person. Weeks passed. Then months. No capture notices worked. No bounty whispers paid off. Margaret Garner stopped appearing in ledgers. That alone tells you everything. Some say she reached the north again during the chaos before the war, slipping through cracks opened by bigger violence. Some say she crossed into Canada and lived under another name, working, surviving, never telling her story because stories are dangerous when you're trying to stay free. Others say she died and the truth died with her. But here's what matters. From that moment on, plantation owners talked different. Not in public, never in public, in private. They talked about women who were too quiet. About mothers who watched too closely. About the danger of pushing people until the only move left was the one that shatters everything. Margaret became more than a name. She became a calculation. A reminder that ownership has limits, and when those limits are crossed, the response isn't always submission. Sometimes it's defiance so absolute it breaks the system's illusion of control. That's the part history doesn't like to sit with, because it means the powerless were never powerless in the way the powerful wanted to believe. They were watching, learning, waiting. And when the moment came, one woman proved that even in chains, a person can still make a move that echoes longer than empires. That's where her story stops on paper. But the question she left behind, that one keeps walking, quiet, patient, looking for the next place the door starts to close. Years later, men still lowered their voices when her name came up. That's how you know a story landed where it wasn't supposed to. No plaque, no official record, just pauses in conversation, just looks exchanged between people who understood that some ghosts don't need chains to be dangerous. Plantation owners blamed the war for everything that followed. That was convenient. But before cannons ever fired, before uniforms split the country in two, something else had already cracked. Confidence. Because Margaret Garner proved something that scared them more than rebellion. She proved control wasn't permanent. She proved obedience had a breaking point. And worse, she proved that when that point is crossed, the response isn't always chaos. Sometimes it's precision. Sometimes it's a move so final that the system can't recover without showing its true face. After her disappearance, owners changed rules quietly. Children were watched closer. Women were monitored harder. Sales happened faster, cleaner, before attachment could form. Fear doesn't always roar. Sometimes it reorganizes. And then the war came. And suddenly men who'd spent their lives treating people like inventory were being told they were property of the state, drafted, ordered, sent to die. Funny how the rules shift when the power balance moves. Some soldiers claimed they saw a woman during the war years, north of the border, calm, scarred hands, eyes that missed nothing. Some said she ran a boarding house. Others said she helped people move quietly the way she once had. No proof, just consistency, which matters more. Margaret never gave interviews, never told her story for applause, never asked to be understood. She didn't need validation. She'd already made her point. The system tried to bury her because systems fear examples. They fear people who force others to choose between comfort and conscience. Because once that choice is made publicly, there's no going back to pretending. That's why her story keeps resurfacing. Not because of the blood, but because of the clarity. She saw the board. She saw the trap. And when the last door closed, she didn't beg to be let out. She made a move that made everyone else show their hand. And that's the kind of power no chain can hold. The only question left is who's next. Here's the part they never managed to lock down. Stories like hers don't stay in the past. They travel, quietly at first. From mouth to ear, from mother to daughter, from one tired man to another who's starting to notice the math doesn't add up. Margaret's name stopped being just a name. It became a signal. When someone said it low, they weren't talking about what she did. They were talking about when enough is enough. After the war, the paperwork changed. New laws, new language, same hunger underneath. Different uniforms, same instincts. Ownership didn't disappear. It learned how to dress better. And every time the system tried to rebrand itself, through contracts, prisons, debt, borders, her story slid back into the conversation like a blade you forgot was still on the table. Because the lesson wasn't about violence. It was about limits. Push people far enough and they stop asking for mercy. They start calculating outcomes. That's what scared them, not the knife, not the blood, the clarity. Margaret never asked permission to be human. She took responsibility instead. And responsibility is dangerous in the hands of someone who has nothing left to lose. So when you hear her name now, don't think about history. Think about patterns. Think about what happens when the door closes. When the law sides with profit. When children become numbers again. When power assumes silence means surrender. Because somewhere right now, someone is standing in that same narrow space Margaret once stood in, watching the exits disappear, counting footsteps, feeling the pressure build, and deciding quietly, carefully, what their move is going to be. The only thing we don't know yet is whether the people on the other side of the door are ready for what comes next. There's a reason her story never ends clean. Clean endings are for people who believe the system eventually fixes itself. Margaret never believed that. She believed in leverage, in pressure, in knowing when the room has shifted even if nobody else admitted it yet. Long after the war uniforms were folded away and the laws rewrote themselves in nicer handwriting, the same kind of men still ran the same kind of games. Different names, different excuses, same hunger. They built new cages and called them something else. And every time they did, someone would bring her up, not in speeches, in whispers. She didn't wait for permission. That's what happens when you corner a mother. You push people far enough, they stop playing defense. That last one made men uncomfortable, because defense is predictable, offense is not. Margaret became a quiet line in the sand. A reminder that there's a moment when fear flips into resolve, and once it does, control gets shaky. Very shaky. People like to ask what kind of woman she was at the end. Broken, haunted, regretful. That question misses the point. The better question is this. What kind of system creates someone like her? Because she wasn't an anomaly, she was a response, a consequence. And consequences don't disappear just because time passes. They wait. They adapt. They show up in new forms, in new neighborhoods, with new paperwork. And the dangerous thing is, the people running things today like to believe they're smarter than the ones before them, more refined, more insulated. They think history only punishes the obvious villains. That's another lie. History punishes arrogance. It punishes men who think they own the board and forget the pieces are alive. Margaret saw that before most people ever dared to say it. She understood something timeless. When power stops listening, it starts bleeding. And once that happens, no amount of law, money, or force can put the illusion back together the same way. So if you're wondering why her name still circulates, why it still makes rooms go quiet, why it still feels dangerous to say out loud, it's because her story isn't finished. It's just waiting. Waiting for the next door to close. This is where the story leaves the page and starts looking back at you, not asking for sympathy, not asking for judgment, asking for honesty. Margaret Garner never got a monument, no street, no official apology stamped in marble. Systems don't apologize to people who expose them. They erase. But erasure only works when nobody remembers why the silence exists. And people remembered, because her story isn't really about what she did in that cabin. That's just the moment the mask slipped. It's about what happens when power assumes obedience is infinite, when law protects ownership instead of life, when children become entries instead of souls. Margaret didn't burn the house down. She showed everyone what it was built on. That's why her name never sits comfortably in history books. She doesn't fit the clean categories. She won't stay contained as tragedy or heroism. She exists in that dangerous space where the question turns back on the listener. What do you do when the system gives you no good options? What do you do when every door leads back to the same hell? Do you wait for permission that will never come? Do you trust laws written by people who profit from your silence? Or do you make a move that forces everyone else to confront the truth they've been avoiding? Margaret chose, not because she wanted to be remembered, because she refused to disappear quietly. And that's the part that still unsettles people with power, not the blood, not the crime, the refusal. Because once someone shows that refusal is possible, once they prove the board can be flipped, the game is never the same again. That's why her story doesn't end. It just goes quiet and waits for the next door to start closing.